Nobody ever saw him coming. That wasn't luck. That was design. In a city like New York, where noise was constant and ambition louder, most men tried to be seen. They wore their success like armor, flashy suits, expensive watches, loud entrances into crowded rooms. They wanted recognition. They needed it. Roy DeMeo built something far more powerful. He built invisibility. By the late 1970s, New York was a living machine of opportunity and decay. The streets pulsed with movement, yellow cabs weaving through traffic, businessmen chasing deals, hustlers chasing survival. It was a city where everything could be bought, sold, or taken. Roy understood that better than most. He wasn't born into power. He wasn't handed influence. What he had was something far more dangerous: patience, discipline, and a mind wired to see systems where others saw randomness. To Roy, crime wasn't chaos. It was structure waiting to be organized. He didn't start big. No one ever does. Small deals, small risks, small wins. But unlike others, Roy didn't chase immediate rewards. He studied patterns: who controlled what, where the money flowed, where the inefficiencies were. And then he began to build. Car theft was his breakthrough. At the time, stealing cars was messy business. Independent operators, inconsistent methods, high risk for low reward. Most cars were stripped locally or resolved in crude ways that attracted attention. Roy saw something else: scale. What if the cars didn't stay in New York? What if they disappeared completely? That question changed everything. Instead of isolated thefts, Roy created a network. Drivers, scouts, mechanics, transporters, each role clearly defined. Cars were taken quickly, processed faster, and moved out of the country before anyone could react. Within days, vehicles stolen in Manhattan were on ships bound for distant markets. It wasn't theft anymore. It was logistics. And logistics meant money. Serious money. The kind that didn't just elevate you, it made you indispensable. That's when his name started traveling upward, not in headlines. In conversations. Quiet ones. Rooms where decisions were made without ever being written down. That's how he came onto the radar of John Gotti. Gotti wasn't just looking for muscle. Anyone could be violent. Violence was cheap. What he valued, what few understood, was efficiency. Roy delivered that. Consistently, predictably, profitably. And in that world, those three things were more valuable than loyalty alone. Roy didn't try to impress Gotti. He didn't need to. His work spoke for him. Money flowed upward like clockwork, and with every delivery, his position strengthened. But money was only one part of Roy's empire. The other part was control. Because building systems is one thing. Protecting them is another. And protection, in that world, required something most men couldn't stomach. The Germany Lounge didn't look like much from the outside. Just another bar in Brooklyn. Dim lighting. Regular customers. Nothing that would make you stop and look twice. That was intentional. Inside, it was business as usual. Behind it. That was where reality changed. The back room of the Germany Lounge became something else entirely. A place where problems were solved permanently. Roy's crew operated with precision that bordered on ritual. There was no chaos, no hesitation. Every movement had a purpose. Every action followed a pattern refined over time. People who became liabilities, informants, threats, loose ends, were brought there. They didn't leave. What made it terrifying wasn't just what happened. It was how efficiently it happened. No noise. No mistakes, no trace. Roy believed in systems, even in violence, especially in violence, because to him unpredictability was the enemy. Whether it was moving stolen cars or eliminating risks, the goal was always the same: control every variable. And for a long time, he did. That duality defined him. On one side, a man running one of the most profitable operations in the city. On the other, a figure surrounded by whispers, stories that sounded exaggerated, almost mythical. But the truth didn't need exaggeration. It was already extreme, and yet Roy didn't see himself as what others feared. In his mind, he was a professional, a provider, a man who had figured out how the world really worked and adapted accordingly. He went home at night, sat at the dinner table, lived a life that, from the outside, looked almost ordinary. That contrast made him harder to read, harder to predict, harder to stop. Because the most dangerous men aren't the ones who look dangerous, they're the ones who don't. By the early 1980s, Roy DeMeo wasn't just successful, he was essential. His operations generated millions. His systems ran without interruption. His crew was loyal, disciplined, and feared. In a world built on instability, Roy had created something rare: consistency. And consistency breeds confidence. Maybe too much of it. Because while Roy was perfecting his systems, someone else was watching them. Law enforcement had started noticing patterns. Cars disappearing in clusters. Connections forming between seemingly unrelated cases. Names surfacing repeatedly in investigations. At first, it was background noise. Nothing concrete. Nothing immediate. But patterns once seen can't be unseen. And Roy's greatest strength, his consistency, was beginning to work against him. The machine he built was too perfect, too efficient, too visible in its invisibility. He didn't panic. That wasn't his nature. But he adjusted. Slight changes, different routes, new layers of separation between operations. He refined the system the way he always had, methodically, calmly. Still, there was something he couldn't eliminate: attention. And attention, in that world, was a slow-moving threat. It didn't strike immediately. It built quietly, until it became unavoidable. Roy had spent years eliminating risks. Now, for the first time, he was becoming one. Not to the police, to his own world. Because in organizations like the Gambino crime family, survival isn't about what you've done. It's about what you might cost. And Roy DeMeo was starting to look expensive. He hadn't failed. He hadn't slipped. He hadn't made mistakes. But sometimes perfection is its own kind of problem. Because the higher you rise, the more visible your fall becomes. And somewhere, in rooms Roy wasn't in, conversations were beginning. Quiet ones, the kind that don't include the subject. The kind that end careers and lives. Roy didn't hear those conversations. Not yet. But he felt something. A shift, subtle but real. The kind of shift a man like him couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, the system he built wasn't entirely under his control. And that was the beginning of the end. Because in Roy DeMeo's world, there was one rule that overpowered all others. You can build the perfect machine, but you can never control who decides to shut it down. Power doesn't disappear overnight. It shifts. Quietly, so quietly, in fact, that most people don't even realize it's happening until the ground beneath them is already gone. Roy DeMeo had built something most men only dreamed of. Not just money, not just influence, control, real control. The kind that didn't depend on presence. The kind where things moved exactly as they were supposed to, even when he wasn't there to watch them. Cars disappeared, money flowed. People followed orders. Everything worked. And that was the problem. Because in a world built on uncertainty, control doesn't make you safe, it makes you dangerous. At first, nothing seemed different. The same meetings, the same routines, the same flow of cash moving upward through the chain. If you looked from the outside, you'd see nothing but success. But Roy didn't look at the surface. He never had. He paid attention to what most people ignored. The pauses, the tone, the silence between words. And that's where he felt it first. Conversations that used to stretch became shorter. People who used to speak freely chose their words more carefully. Eye contact lingered just a little too long or disappeared entirely. Respect was still there. That never vanished completely. But respect and trust are not the same thing. And trust, that was fading. Roy understood patterns. That was the foundation of everything he built. Patterns in movement, patterns in behavior, patterns in risk. And now, the pattern was changing. Law enforcement wasn't guessing anymore. They were learning, adapting, connecting pieces that were never supposed to fit together. Cars weren't just being reported stolen. They were being tracked across timelines, linked across locations, studied in ways that turned random events into structured evidence. What Roy had built so carefully was starting to reveal itself, not publicly, not yet, but to the people who mattered. And attention, real attention, was the one thing no one in that world could afford. Because the police, they were predictable, they followed procedures, they built cases slowly, but internal decisions, those were immediate, final, and irreversible. Roy had seen it before. He had been part of it before. Men who became liabilities didn't get warnings. They didn't get second chances. They were removed. Not out of anger, not out of emotion, out of necessity. Because in that life, survival wasn't about loyalty. It was about risk management. And risk had a way of spreading. One investigation leads to another. One name leads to 5 more. One mistake, no matter how small, creates pressure that travels upward. And when pressure reaches the top, something has to give. Roy wasn't making mistakes. That was the irony. He was doing everything right, too consistent, too precise, too effective. And in that world, perfection creates a different kind of fear. Because if someone can build something that powerful, what happens when it starts attracting attention? What happens when it becomes too big to ignore? The higher-ups didn't panic. They never panic. They observed. They calculated. They waited. And slowly, they began to distance themselves. Roy noticed that too. Meetings he used to be central to, he was now hearing about after they happened. Conversations that once included him no longer required his presence. Decisions that once depended on him were already made without him. That wasn't coincidence. That was positioning. The kind that happens before something final. Roy didn't react emotionally. That wasn't who he was. He adjusted, pulled back slightly, reduced exposure, changed routines, created more space between himself and the operations he once controlled directly. Not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to observe, because Roy understood something most people didn't. When the system starts shifting, you don't fight it immediately. You study it. But this wasn't a system he could outmaneuver. This was bigger than logistics, bigger than planning. This was perception, and perception was already turning against him. Some believed his own crew was getting nervous. Others thought the decision had already been made at a higher level. No one said it directly. They didn't need to. In that world, silence speaks louder than words. Roy saw the signs, all of them, the hesitation, the distance, the absence of certainty. But seeing the signs doesn't mean you can escape the outcome. Because where would he go? Everything he had built, every connection, every dollar, every relationship, was tied to the same structure that was now evaluating him. You can't separate yourself from a system like that, not when you help design it, not when it defines your existence, and certainly not when it's already deciding what to do with you. The machine kept running, cars still moved, money still flowed, orders were still followed. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. Roy DeMeo was no longer controlling the system. He was inside it, and for the first time in years, he wasn't the one setting the rules. He was the one being measured against them. Measured for risk, measured for exposure, measured for cost. And in that world, once you are measured, the outcome is only a matter of time. Because the final decision is never rushed. It forms slowly, quietly, behind closed doors, until one day, it's no longer a discussion, it's a conclusion. And by then, there's nothing left to negotiate. Because in Roy DeMeo's world, you don't fall when you fail, you fall when you become too important to ignore. Disappearances don't happen in a single moment. They begin long before anyone realizes something is missing. By the time people started asking where Roy DeMeo was, he was already gone. Not physically, not yet, but in every other way that mattered. The calls became fewer. The meetings stopped. The routines, the same ones he had followed with precision for years, began to dissolve into silence. At first, no one questioned it. Men like Roy didn't operate on schedules that others understood. He came and went as he pleased. That was part of his authority, part of his control. But control, once lost, doesn't announce itself. It fades, and Roy could feel it slipping. He still moved through the city, but something had changed. The streets didn't feel the same. The same corners, the same buildings, the same late-night drives, but the weight behind them was different. He wasn't observing anymore. He was being observed, not openly, not obviously, but enough to know. There's a moment in every man's life when instinct becomes certainty, when the doubt disappears and what's left is understanding. Roy had reached that moment. He knew, not the exact time, not the exact place, but the outcome, and still he didn't run. Because running requires somewhere to go, and Roy had built his entire existence inside a system that didn't allow exits. Every connection he had, every dollar he earned, every favor he owed or was owed, all of it pointed back to the same structure. You can't disappear from something like that. You can only wait for it to decide what to do with you. The days leading up to the end were quiet, too quiet. No confrontations, no warnings, no sudden explosions of conflict, just normal life. Or at least, something that looked like it. That's what made it unsettling. Because in that world, the most dangerous moments are the calm ones. Roy still sat at the table, still spoke in measured tones, still carried himself like a man in control. But inside he was calculating time, not how to escape, how much he had left. Some say he trusted the wrong people. Others say he trusted no one, and that was the problem. But trust didn't matter anymore, because the decision had already been made. And once that happens, everything else is just timing. The final day didn't arrive with warning. It never does. There was no dramatic lead-up, no visible tension in the air, no signal that anything was about to end. Just another day, another meeting, another conversation, and then nothing. Roy DeMeo disappeared. No witnesses, no noise, no immediate trace, just absence. At first, people filled that absence with stories. Maybe he left. Maybe he saw it coming and got out in time. Maybe he was hiding, waiting for things to cool down. But those who understood that world knew better. Men like Roy didn't leave. Not without consequences. Weeks passed, then months. The silence grew heavier, because in that life, silence isn't peace, it's confirmation. Eventually the truth surfaced, not in a dramatic reveal, not in a public display, but quietly. His body was found in the trunk of a car, not abandoned in the open, not displayed as a warning. Hidden, contained, almost controlled. That detail mattered, because it said everything without saying anything. This wasn't chaos. This was method. The same method Roy had lived by, the same precision he had built his empire on, turned back on him. No one claimed responsibility. No one confirmed the order. Some believed it came from within his own crew. Others believed it came from higher up. The truth, it didn't matter anymore. Because the outcome was the same. Roy DeMeo was gone, not just dead, removed, erased. And the system he built, it didn't collapse, it didn't slow down, it didn't even hesitate. Because that's the final truth of that world. No one is bigger than the machine. Not the men who run it. Not the men who profit from it. And not even the men who build it. Roy had spent years perfecting control, eliminating risk, designing systems that operated flawlessly. But there was one variable he could never account for. The moment he became the risk, and in that moment, everything he built stopped protecting him and started working against him. That's how it ends, not with chaos, not with noise, but with silence. A man who built invisibility, or became invisible, and the world kept moving, as if he had never been there at all. Because in the end, the most powerful men don't fall when they fail. They fall when they become too important to keep alive.